The man who followed me home for weeks. The first sighting. The office building stood tall and silent as Emily packed up her things for the day, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead filling the quiet space. It had been another long day, papers, emails, endless meetings, but at least it was over. Her hand shook slightly as she gathered her purse, a habit she hadn't quite shaken since her first job, the nervous excitement of leaving for the night. As she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she adjusted the collar of her coat against the chill and began her walk down the street. The city was winding down, the sun's last rays just beginning to dip behind the horizon. People bustled around, heading to buses or hopping into their cars, their faces tired from the day's work. Nothing seemed unusual, but then she saw him. At the corner of the block, just outside her office building, stood a man. He was tall, dressed in a dark jacket, with his hands tucked into his pockets. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hood, but Emily could see his stance, still, like he wasn't waiting for anything, just watching. She paused, tilting her head slightly. Probably just another person waiting for someone, she thought. She shrugged it off, heading for the bus stop across the street. The next day, as she stepped out of the office, she saw him again. There he was, standing in the same spot, as though he had been there the entire day. He hadn't moved. His eyes, shadowed beneath his hood, were trained on her. But when she glanced back after crossing the street, he hadn't followed. Okay, maybe it's just a coincidence, she reassured herself, shaking off the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. But the next day, it happened again. And the day after that, he was always there. Outside the office building, lingering by the bus stop, standing at the cafe window when she picked up her coffee. She didn't know why, but the sight of him made her uneasy. It was as though he were everywhere she went, silently watching, never approaching, never speaking, just watching. One evening, after a long day, Emily decided to confront him. Her heartbeat was steady in her chest as she walked purposefully toward the corner of the block. There he was again, standing in his usual spot. The wind rustled the leaves of nearby trees as Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "Are you following me?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly despite her attempt to sound confident. The man didn't move. He didn't acknowledge her question. "Are you?" she asked again, more forcefully this time, a strange mix of anger and fear swirling in her gut. But before she could get another word out, she felt it. A cold shiver ran down her spine, like a presence was creeping up behind her. She tore her gaze away from him for a split second, just long enough to glance down at her phone, the light flashing briefly as a message came through. When she looked back up, he was gone. She froze. The spot where he had been standing was empty. No sign of him. Nothing. She scanned the street, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked left. She looked right. He was nowhere to be seen. The city around her continued to move unaware. It must be a trick of the light, she thought desperately, looking around again. But no, the area was still. The streetlights flickered faintly, casting shadows across the pavement. As she walked away, Her footsteps echoed in the sudden silence. Emily felt a tightness in her chest. Her mind raced. Had she imagined it? But then, as she passed the corner where he had stood just moments before, she heard it. A faint shuffle of feet behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. Footsteps in the dark. The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of distant rain as Emily walked home from work. The streets were quiet, too quiet, and the orange glow of streetlights stretched long shadows across the sidewalk. She wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the empty road. It was her usual route, the one she'd taken for years. She'd grown used to the rhythm of the pavement beneath her shoes, the familiar sights of the city winding down for the night. But tonight was different. She first noticed it when she crossed the intersection at Maple and 7th. The faint sound of footsteps. At first, she brushed it off, thinking it was just another pedestrian behind her, someone who'd crossed her path. She quickened her pace, her heels clicking faster on the pavement. But the footsteps kept pace. No matter how fast she walked, they mirrored her every move. It's just someone else walking, she told herself, forcing her breath to stay steady. But when she glanced over her shoulder, the street behind her was empty. The sidewalk was clear. A shiver ran down her spine, but she pushed on, telling herself it was nothing. She walked faster, her eyes darting around, the footsteps matching her every step. The city felt unnervingly silent. There were no cars, no people, just the steady rhythm of her own steps and the persistent, invisible footsteps that followed. She glanced over her shoulder again. The street was empty, nothing but shadows. It must be the wind, she thought. Maybe someone's walking behind me in the distance. But when she sped up, the footsteps didn't slow. They stayed perfectly aligned with her own. Her pulse quickened. She had to get home. She increased her pace, almost running now, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The footsteps kept pace. They were right behind her. She turned sharply down the next street, desperate to lose whatever was following her. The footsteps mirrored her turn, each step sharp and distinct, never falling behind. She darted through alleyways, down side streets, trying everything to shake the sensation of being followed. But the steps never stopped. They never wavered. Finally, out of breath and near panic, she turned into the alleyway behind her apartment building. She fumbled for her keys, hands shaking, and bolted through the back door. Slamming it shut, she locked it with a quick twist of the key. She leaned against the door, panting, trying to calm her racing heart. It's over, she repeated to herself. But the sound of footsteps had followed her all the way here. Even now, she could hear them, faint but unmistakable, tapping across the alley outside her building. She froze, her eyes widening. No, it couldn't be. Her apartment was a small refuge, a place she could escape to, a place that should have been safe. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled her apartment. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She walked toward the window, heart thudding in her chest. She peered outside, but it was dark, nothing but the black night stretching across the empty alley. There was no one there. Then a soft sound broke the stillness, a heavy, slow breath. Right outside the door, Emily's blood ran cold. The sound was so close, so real, she could almost feel it on her skin. Her eyes shot to the peephole. Nothing. The door handle rattled slightly. She backed away slowly, not daring to make a sound. She could hear the breathing, steady, patient. Someone was out there, and they knew she was inside. She backed away from the door, feeling the walls close in around her. It was silent now, except for the steady thrum of her heartbeat in her ears. She couldn't explain it. She couldn't make sense of it. But the footsteps, the breathing, they weren't just outside her door. They were inside her head, following her every step. The note under my door. The unease had settled deep in Emily's chest, a constant weight she could never shake off. It had been weeks since the footsteps, weeks since she first felt like someone was watching her every move. She couldn't sleep without feeling the tight knot in her stomach. The terror had escalated. It was as though the world around her had turned into a stage, and someone was standing just out of sight, waiting for her to make the wrong move. Her first instinct had been to do nothing, to ignore it, but when the footsteps followed her home again, right into her apartment building, she realized that ignoring the fear was no longer an option. Emily needed answers, or at least to feel a shred of safety. That's when she installed the security cameras. She spent an entire weekend setting up a network of cameras in her apartment, aimed at every entrance. The front door, the windows, even the hallway outside her apartment. She told herself that with the cameras, at least she could get some peace of mind. At least she could know for sure if anyone was in the building. But every night after that, she sat in front of the monitor, watching the screens. The cameras showed nothing. Just an empty apartment. Nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, in the quiet moments when she felt the hairs on her neck stand up, when the air in the room seemed to shift, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The footage, when she reviewed it, was always the same, static. Just static during the exact moment she felt the most vulnerable, when a presence seemed to press down on her chest, suffocating her. There was never a shadow, never a figure, just static. But the worst moment came one morning, a Saturday when she had just woken up, rubbing her tired eyes. The sun streamed in through the curtains, casting long, warm beams of light across her floor. It seemed like an ordinary day, like the thousands before it, but the moment she opened her front door to step outside, she froze. There on the floor, just in front of the threshold, was a small, folded piece of paper. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't heard anything. No knock. No sound of footsteps. She was certain she had locked the door. Yet here it was, this note slipped under her door while she slept. She bent down slowly, fingers trembling as she unfolded it. The handwriting was jagged and messy, like it had been written in haste. "You look beautiful when you're scared." Emily's blood ran cold as she read the words. She looked down at the paper, then back up at the door. There was no sign of forced entry. No broken lock. No sign of anyone having been in her apartment. And yet, this note, this chilling message, had appeared out of nowhere. She quickly closed the door, bolting it behind her, feeling the panic surge within her. She was suddenly hyper-aware of every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound from the building. Was someone inside? Her eyes darted around the apartment, as though expecting something or someone to step out from the shadows. But nothing moved. Emily sat down on her couch, the notes still clutched tightly in her hands. How? She thought desperately. How did they get in? She checked the cameras again, but there was nothing but more static. The same empty apartment. No figure. No movement. She ran her fingers over the jagged handwriting, trying to make sense of it. Who would do this? And yet, there it was, right in front of her, an unmistakable, terrifying sign that someone had been watching her. Someone had been in her space, and they knew things about her. They knew her fear. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood up, turning to face the walls. The apartment, which had once felt like a safe haven, now felt like a prison. Someone was in her life now, and they were watching. They were closer than she could ever imagine. The shadow in the reflection. The darkness of Emily's apartment had become suffocating. Every corner seemed to hide something, a lurking presence she could never quite shake. The footsteps, the breathing, the note under her door. Everything pointed to one undeniable truth. Someone was in her life, watching her. And now she had to find out who. Determined to catch the elusive figure that had haunted her every step, Emily decided to take matters into her own hands. No more second-guessing. No more rationalizing the unexplainable. She would record herself sleeping. She would capture the moment, the proof, the thing that had eluded her for so long. It wasn't easy setting up the camera. Her hands trembled as she placed it on the dresser, aimed at her bed, making sure the lens was unobstructed. The red light blinked steadily, a reminder that tonight, everything will be captured. Every movement, every shadow. Emily turned off the lights and crawled into bed, trying to ignore the gnawing anxiety in her stomach. She closed her eyes, hoping that sleep would come easily, though she knew it wouldn't. The darkness seemed to press in around her, oppressive and thick, but she forced herself to drift off. The night passed in fragments of uneasy dreams, and as the first rays of dawn began to stretch across the sky, Emily woke. She groggily reached for her phone, checking the time, 7:42 a.m. Slowly, she rose from the bed and moved to the dresser. The camera was still blinking its tiny red light. She pressed play. The footage played back in silence, the gentle rise and fall of her sleeping form filling the screen. She watched herself breathe, her chest rising and falling in slow rhythm. But then, at exactly 3:17 a.m., something caught her eye. At the foot of her bed, standing motionless in the dark, was a shadow. It wasn't a shape she recognized. It was tall, its features indistinct, like a void, an absence in the darkness. The figure stood there, perfectly still, just watching her. It was unnerving how quiet it was, how it didn't make a sound, didn't even breathe. It just stood there, as though waiting for something. Her heart raced. The figure was unmistakable, an intrusion on her privacy. The shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally across the floor, barely visible in the dim light of the room, but there. It was there. Emily leaned in closer, her breath shallow as she watched the footage, her pulse quickening with each second. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply loomed at the edge of her bed, a silent observer of her most vulnerable moment. Then, just as she thought she could take no more, the screen flickered. For one brief, terrifying moment, the image distorted, the screen flashing white static tearing across the video. The shadow at the foot of her bed was gone. Gone. Just like that. The silence in the room felt deafening as Emily sat frozen in place. She watched the screen for a long time, hoping, praying that somehow the figure would reappear, that she had missed something, anything that would explain what she had just seen. But the footage didn't lie. The figure was gone, and there was no trace of it left. She rewound the footage, playing it again over and over, hoping for an explanation for something. But there was nothing. Her hands shook violently as she set the phone down, her stomach churning. She had seen it with her own eyes. There was no denying what was captured on camera. A shadowy figure at the foot of her bed, watching her sleep. It was real. And whoever or whatever it wasn't done. She suddenly felt cold, her breath hitching as she turned her head toward the doorway. The apartment, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a cage. She could feel it, the presence. It was still there somewhere, just out of sight. Watching her. Waiting. What does it want? She couldn't escape the question, the haunting feeling that this was only the beginning. The face in the closet. Emily had reached her breaking point. The constant feeling of being watched, the creeping fear that haunted her every step, she couldn't take it anymore. She needed to leave, to escape, to put miles between herself and whatever it was that had made her apartment feel like a prison. The decision was made. She packed her things hastily, throwing clothes into a suitcase, her hands shaking as she zipped it up. Her apartment felt colder now, emptier. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally, and the silence echoed in her ears like a warning. She moved quickly, her mind set on the road ahead, on freedom. All she had to do was grab a few final things from the closet. Then she would be out of here. She opened the door and reached for her suitcase, her fingers brushing against the cool fabric of her coats. But then, as she pulled the suitcase from the shelf, something hit her, foul, overwhelming odor, something rotten and rancid. Emily froze. The smell was so thick, so suffocating, that it made her stomach churn. She instinctively stepped back, the suitcase half pulled from the closet. Her eyes darted around the small, dimly lit space, her breath quickening. She had never noticed this smell before, and it made her skin crawl. It was as though something had been festering here for weeks. As her gaze traveled downward, something caught her eye, something wedged between her coats. At first, she thought it was just a pile of old clothes, but then she realized it was too neat, too deliberate. A crumpled hoodie, a pair of worn-out shoes, and beneath it all a small, thin mattress. Her heart began to race, her breath shallow as she took a step closer, the smell growing worse with every movement. She pushed the coats aside with trembling hands, her mind struggling to make sense of the horrifying sight before her. There was no mistaking it. Someone had been living here, in her closet. Her pulse quickened as she leaned down, her stomach twisting in knots. The mattress was stained, the fabric torn in places, and there were crumbs scattered across the floor. A half-empty water bottle sat nearby, a forgotten piece of someone's life. Emily stumbled back, gasping for air as the realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Someone had been hiding in her apartment, right under her nose. She spun around to grab her phone from the counter, her hand shaking as she unlocked it. Her heart pounded at her chest as she quickly checked the time, 3 a.m. It was too late. There was no one else in the apartment. And yet, just as she started to dial the police, A sudden vibration from her phone made her freeze. Text from an unknown number. "You were never supposed to find me." The words sent a shockwave of terror through her entire body. Her hands trembled as she stared at the screen, the blood draining from her face. It wasn't just the message, it was the chilling, ominous nature of it. Whoever had been hiding in her closet had known she would eventually find them. They had been waiting for this moment. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked back at the closet, her eyes scanning the dimly lit space. It was empty now, just the coats, the shoes, the mattress. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, watching her the entire time. She stepped back toward the door, her heart pounding louder with each step. The apartment that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a tomb. She could feel it. That oppressive, lingering presence. It was still there somewhere, waiting. Emily slammed the closet door shut, the finality of the action sending a wave of cold dread through her. But she knew she couldn't stay here any longer. Not after what she had found. Without a second thought, she grabbed her suitcase and rushed for the door. The text message still burned in her mind, the words echoing in her ears. "You were never supposed to find me." Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't dare to check it. She was already out the door, her feet carrying her away from the nightmare that had been her life for the past few weeks. The door clicked shut behind her, but in her mind, she could still hear it, the soft creak of the closet door, the faint rustling of something hidden just out of sight.